Thank you very much for coming tonight. Oh, go the wrong way. I wanted to take 45 minutes of your time to talk about, firstly, why I think behavioural science is so relevant to marketing. I'll talk about some of the experiments that I've done in the last few years, of course, some of the biases involved, but I also wanted to tackle head-on some of the supposed criticisms of behavioural science and say why I think those aren't valid. And hopefully, if we believe that, behavioural science might get used even more. But before getting into the kind of meat of the presentation, I thought it might be a good place to start with how I first got into behavioural science. Because there was a very specific moment. Normally with things like football or other passions, you kind of drift into your interests. But I can remember the exact time and place when I became interested in behavioural science. And it was about 600 yards away on Oxford Street, outside the Carphone warehouse, what was the Tottenham pub. And I was sitting in the back of a cab, coming back from a meeting with the NHS. They were one of our clients, and we were advising them on how to encourage blood donations. And as I was sitting in the back of the cab, I read a story about a lady called Kitty Genovese. Has anyone heard of this story? Got a couple of people. Okay, well, in 1964, on March the 13th, Kitty Genovese, who was a bar manager in New York, was coming home. She was coming home at 3 a.m. in the morning, and she parked her little Fiat car a couple of hundred yards from her apartment block. And unfortunately, as she was walking towards the door, she was seen by a man called Winston Moseley, who was a serial killer. He saw her, stalked her, and stabbed her. Now, for some reason, Moseley got nervous, dropped his knife, and ran away. But in the time that Genovese was trying to crawl towards her apartment door, Moseley regathered his courage, came back, and murdered Genovese. Now, it's an unpleasant, it's a brutal story, but in New York in 1964, there were 636 murders, and it was only Kitty Genovese's who got on the front page of the New York Times. And the reason it got on the front page was not the brutality of the attack, but because the Times claimed, and I do say claimed, they claimed that there were 37 witnesses who saw the attack and didn't intervene. No one called the police, no one went down and helped her. Now, the New York Times said this was symptomatic of the city's moral decay. But two psychologists, Bibb Latané and John Darley, came to a very different conclusion. They said the Times was wrong, that it wasn't that no one had helped despite there being 37 witnesses. They argued that no one helped because there was 37 witnesses, that there was a diffusion of responsibility. So over the next few years, Latané and Darley weren't happy just keeping this as a hypothesis. They went out and started creating experiments to see if their gut feeling was true. And the experiments were various different guises, but they all had the same principle. They would stage an emergency, a fire, someone having an epileptic fit, and then they would either make sure there was one witness to that emergency or a group of witnesses. And what they found backed up their original hypothesis, that when people were on their own, they were far more likely to help and intervene than when they were in a group. Now, when I read this, I thought, bloody hell, this is exactly the problem we are facing on the blood service. We're facing what Darley and Latané called the bystander effect, that we're suffering from this diffusion of responsibility. We're going out and asking everyone to donate, and therefore most people think, well, why should I bother going through the time, the inconvenience and the effort of donating when I know everyone else has been asked? So what we did, very simple tactic. Went and spoke to a brilliant strategist called Charlie Snow, who worked at DLKW at the time, and persuaded him to change the copy that they were running. So rather than go out and saying, blood stocks are low in the UK, please donate, all we did, and this was back in 2004, 2005, was change the copy to say, blood stocks are low in Birmingham, please donate. Blood stocks are low in Brentwood, please donate. Blood stocks are low in Basildon, please donate. It's a very, very simple tactic. A couple of weeks later, the cost per response data came back, and we'd reduced the cost per response by 10 to 15%. So a 50-year-old bias, very simply applied, had a marked effect on the results of the advertising. And that was when I first became interested in behavioural science. And I thought that clients should be really excited about this too. That it's a very relevant subject. It's about behaviour change, and that's what we're all trying to do. You know, we're trying to get people to pay more, switch to our brand, buy a little bit more, pay a premium. It's all about behaviour change. And it's also very well suited to the nature of communications. That advertising is a phenomenally diverse thing. It covers everything from someone sticking up a poster on a telegraph pole for a lost cat, all the way to airport lobbying the government for the next runway. Now, how can that giant breadth of problems and tasks be solved by one big theory? You know, how can brand purpose, or how brands go, be applied to that great variety of need? So why behavioural science is so good is there isn't one giant theory. There are hundreds of biases, and you can select the one that's most relevant and apply it to the problem you're facing. And what that means is that we're genuinely getting the right solution for a problem, not force-fitting a tool just because it's the only one we have. And then the final reason I thought it was so relevant, so important, was because it was robust. You know, 2004 in a media agency, I think a lot of the recommendations were based on, not quite hearsay, but what was the fashion of the time, what was the opinion of the most eloquent person, what was the opinion of the highest paid person. You know, that's all very well and good, but it's not necessarily the most effective thing to do. Instead, it's far better to use the robust experiments, the peer-reviewed experiments of some of the leading scientists from around the world, people like B.F. Skinner, Leon Festinger, Kahneman or Thaler. And best of all, we don't have to take those experiments on faith. All of the experiments, all of the knowledge is in the public domain. We can take what those scientists have done and adapt it to make sure the biases, run our own experiments, make sure the biases work on our brands or in our category. And that's what I've been spending the last 15 years doing. It started off very small scale. I began with some unappreciated surveys. I started running tests on my colleagues. It was all very small scale to begin with. But one of the very first experiments I did, and this was on colleagues, hadn't quite worked out that maybe media planners weren't the most representative group available, but I started small steps. So the experiment we did here, and I really strongly believe that I think research in advertising and marketing has taken a wrong turn somewhere, that it's become far too complex and time-consuming and expensive, and actually it can be done far quicker and focus on not the technique necessarily, or not the kind of complexity of the technique, but the quality of the output. So I was going to take you through 3 very small experiments and then talk about some of the objections to behavioural science. So the first experiment was for a perfume, and all we did was, when staff were coming in one morning, we engaged in a little bit of subterfuge, or lies, as many people call them, and we told the staff that Armani had launched a new perfume, could they sample it and see what they liked, rate it out of 10, and write a few little adjectives about what they thought of it. And we gave them the Armani perfume, we gave them Chanel No. 5, we gave them lots of other perfumes. And as we were talking to them, we gave them a little spiel about how Armani was made, they could go and get it for 40 quid from Boots, and what the ingredients were. Now, once the people had gone, we got the next group in as they were coming in, and we gave them exactly the same spiel, but we changed one key factor. We said that rather than being 40 quid from Boots, it cost 80 quid. So we'd misdirected everyone, so they thought it was just about a smell test, that it was going to be compared with all these other perfumes. But actually, all that stuff was irrelevant. It was the comparison between the first group and the second group that mattered. And when people thought the perfume was 80 quid, they were twice as likely to say they really liked it as when it cost 40 quid. Now, no one would ever admit that, why do you like that perfume? Because it's expensive. It was always some concocted, what psychologists call confabulation. But the actual effect was the price. So again, this wasn't just a piece of interesting theatre. What we then did was take this to Armani, and we said to them, look, you are lucky enough to work in a category called a Veblen good, where appeal or demand increases with price, so you can take advantage of that. Not in a straightforward manner. We didn't say just stick up your prices, because obviously what people say hits the hard reality of the till and might not follow through. What we said instead was, look, in your range of perfumes, you've got one called Armani Privé. It's 150 quid. It's about 7 times of their main big sellers, 7 times the price. You only put a tiny spend behind it because it doesn't sell much. You should be sticking the vast majority of your spend behind this expensive perfume, the Privé. That will then create the demand, because it's price that drives, desire. That will create the desire, and then that will trickle down to your mainstream brands. So that experiment, it was a bit rough and ready, but it started to set the direction I was certainly going on, mainly around trying to create real-world situations rather than just surveys and focus groups. Because the danger is with a focus group or a survey is that what people do is they create a post-rationalisation of why they've done the things they do. It's normally one that projects them in a very good light, but it doesn't often bear much relationship to reality. So they claim that they want the cow burger, but they end up eating the donuts. So after these kind of early start, then started to get a bit more serious about these experiments, started to think, well, how can we actually involve real people rather than just staff? And as an example of one of the next briefs we got in was from New Look. So New Look a few years ago were introducing a menswear range, and they had a very small budget for this. The idea was, well, we've done women's clothes, we're very well known, let's just do an announcement and men will start buying women's clothes. Men will start buying from our men's range. And the back of my mind, I was thinking, well, I'm not sure if it kind of works that way. Do men really want to shop at a place which is so associated with women's clothes? So we went back and we had this great big expensive approach that we were going to give them so we could basically prove them wrong in their idea. Unsurprisingly, they were not that keen on spending money to derail a project. So what we did instead was I got 12 volunteers around the agency. I took a photo of them in 2 different circumstances. So exactly the same pose, sometimes holding a New Look bag, and then the other time holding a Topman bag, the main competitor. And then I put it up onto a dating site called Badoo. It was called Hot or Not, I think, before Badoo. Has anyone heard of either of those 2 sites? Has anyone used those sites? Amazing. Comscore would tell you millions of people used to use these sites, but I've never been in a room when anyone has admitted to using them. But the uniqueness of the sites was you put up a photo and people would rate how good looking you were out of 10. So what we had was a 2-week experiment to see the strength of the brands. 2 weeks later, I pulled the data and looked at the average scores the blokes were getting. And what I found was that when men had Topman bags, they were 25% better looking, or they were seen as 25% looking, than when they had the New Look bag. So again, a completely realistic circumstance. People didn't know they were taking part in this experiment, but we could go to the brand then with firstly a bit of theatre, but also to say, there was no expense to this. It was about 5 quid because we had to go and buy a T-shirt to get a bag. For 5 quid, we'd managed to prove that actually there was a far bigger job than they thought, and that what they needed to do was either change ideas about unisex shopping or reposition themselves away from being solely a women's clothes shop. So the final example, which is a slightly different take I wanted to take you through, was again a very fast, very quick experiment we did, which was around contactless payment terminals for our retail clients. So 5 or 6 years ago when those terminals were coming in, I think we were kind of slightly spoilt in London in that London got them very quickly, but then a lot of retailers stopped and thought, well, this is actually quite expensive, should we be rolling them out elsewhere? Now, yes, it speeds up the queue, but for an awful lot of expense. A colleague and I, brilliant researcher called Claire Limford, thought, well, maybe it's not only customer service that these benefit, and we wanted to think about, could we test whether there was another benefit of contactless terminals? So we went and stood on Tottenham Court Road, outside little coffee shops, mini marts, small supermarkets, and we tried to stop people and get 5 minutes of their time, which if you've ever tried to do on Tottenham Court Road is a phenomenally dispiriting experience. We spent the first morning until we realised this was just this just wasn't working. No one wants to stop and give you their time. So instead, we came up with an idea where we would give someone, a passerby, something that cost £1, and it meant that pretty much everyone would stop. Can anyone guess the most effective thing that you can give someone, I think, for £1 that will get 5 minutes of their time? Any guesses? Chocolate. People are a bit suspicious if you try and give them food in London. It was actually a scratch card. So we tried pound coins. People don't like being given a pound coin. I think it suggests that they're a little cheap or something. But if you give them a scratch card, you're giving them the dream of winning £1 million. So they were very happy to give their time. So we gave people scratch cards, and then we asked them 3 questions. What have you just spent? So how much? What means of payment have you used? And then finally, can we look at your receipt to see how much they'd actually spent? So what we did was take the claim data and then we compared it with the actual spend and then we split it by payment means. And we saw that when people paid by cash, most of them knew what they'd spent, 75% knew what they'd spent, but those who didn't know overestimated by about 10% their spend. Credit cards, 66% of people knew what they'd spent, and they were as likely to overestimate or underestimate. But for contactless, less than half of people knew what they'd spent, and they invariably underestimated their spend by about 7 or 8%. So we had this 16, 17% swing from cash to contactless, with cash being the memory of overspend and contactless underspend. So we went to those retailers and said, look, there's loads of academic evidence already behind this that there's something called the pain of payment. The more painful the payment, the more price sensitive people become. And cash is the most painful. And then Semester and a few other MIT professors have shown that credit cards, people become less price sensitive. What no one else had done at that stage was show, well, there's even more extreme for contactless. That it's such a throwaway action, it just doesn't feel painful. So people kind of encode it as being less expensive. So he said to them, look, you know, every retailer knows, it's obvious that value is hugely important. What actually matters is not value, it's memory of value. That's what drives people back again. And you can either improve your memory of value by reducing your prices, but that destroys your margins, or see the contactless terminals as a way of driving memory of payment. Introduce those and you'll be perceived as better value. Now that might sound like a out-of-date niche finding, but because I think everyone's got contactless now, you can apply that finding in hundreds of ways. If you go to a restaurant in the next few days, have a look at the menu. Menus are amazing, and if anyone wants to talk about this afterwards, they're amazing psychology experiments. And what you'll find more and more menus do now is remove the pound signs. Now, a lot of people probably do that because it supposedly looks less cluttered. But psychologists have shown, this a psychologist called Cesarego, who's shown that people are 8% less price sensitive when you remove the pound signs. We've done experiments with car brands where we've sent out these giant surveys and we've shown, so it's a Mazda, shown them a picture of the car, details of the car, told a quarter of the people that over a year the cost was 1,200 quid to rent it. The other quarter saw £100 a month. The other quarter saw 23 quid a week, something like that, whatever the number would be. And then the final quarter saw £3.57 a day. So all those numbers, if my maths right, should be the same annual total. But when you ask people for their perception of value, every time you see When you display it as a daily figure, it's seen as better value than a weekly is better than a monthly is better than a yearly. Psychologists call this kind of scope insensitivity, the idea that it's almost like we don't think 6 times 4 is the same as 4 times 6. We put too much weight as consumers on the pound and not enough on the unit of time. So most brands could take advantage of that. Sky could stop talking about its monthly payment, they could talk about its weekly payment. Charities, some of them actually do this. They talk about, donate from 10 pence or 20 pence a day because they know it comes across as much better than the monthly figure. So there are lots and lots of applications of these bias. Just because I've gone for one particular brand, they can be applied in lots of ways. So hopefully some reasons there and some why behavioural science is so important. But then you might be thinking, well, if it's so important, why is it that so few advertisers use it, or it's not used enough? And I think one of the reasons is that people think, well, these biases don't affect me, so why would they affect consumers? And something I've been trying to do to overcome that with clients is going to them with a little survey and testing whether they are affected by biases. And I obviously sent you that same survey. And the first question that you answered, or one of the early questions, was how good at your job are you compared to your peers? Now, if we had a statistician in the room, what they might say is, well, it's obvious, you only had 2 answers. 50% should be better than average, 50% below average. But if there was a psychologist, they would say, well, that's never going to happen. There's a well-known, robust finding about overconfidence. We are very bad at knowing how good we actually are. So what proportion of you do you think? And I did blend this actually because just to get large enough numbers I did a talk at Newsworks, so this is a blend of Newsworks. What proportion of you thought you were better than average at your job, do you think? 20%. 20%? 86. 86% said they were better than average job. It's actually, that sounds bad. This is not reflecting well so far, but bear with me. I've done one group amongst agency staff, and it was 96%. So, I think this is a great sign that we are a little more humble than them.
Does it depend on who you think is looking at it, though?
Oh, it would absolutely, I'm sure. Yeah. Yes.
But it's anonymised.
So if we'd done the same thing and said, like tonight, who's better than their peers at work, I think you'd get a much lower number on this. There is something called a social desirability bias. How we answer reflects what we want people to think of us. With the overconfidence, there will also be an element of we all genuinely believe this. And it's replicated everywhere. Psychology professors who know about the bias of overconfidence, more than 90% say they're better than average lecturers. Even, and this is one of my favourite ever psychology experiments, people who have been injured in car accidents but their fault, when psychologists have gone and interviewed them, even they think they're better than average at driving. This is, I think, part of the human condition. We are, as Timothy Wilson said, we're strangers to ourselves. So be very careful if you ask consumers why they do the things they do. But that was not the only question. There was maybe a more puzzling question about apples, where I asked, how many calories do you think an apple has? More or less than 50? And people had to say more or less. And then how many calories do you think that apple has? Have a guess. And on average, people said 75. Very good. But that wasn't the real experiment, as you might now guess. Always be suspicious if someone interested in psychology starts asking you questions. There'll be something dodgy going on. The other half of you were asked the same question in a very slightly different way. So they were asked, how many calories do you think an apple has? More or less than 150. And they answered more or less. And then, how many calories do you think an apple has? Have a guess. What do you think the answer that time was?
85.
I think someone said 100, pretty much spot on, 113. So that is, I think that's slightly over a 50% swing. Now again, completely predictable through behavioural science. Kahneman and Tversky in 1974 wrote this paper called Judgment Under Uncertainty. And they came up with an idea called anchoring. And anchoring is the idea that if you throw out a number, even if it's spurious, even if it's irrelevant, it affects the listener. The listener might know that it's irrelevant. You know, you would have known, virtually everyone thought 50 was too low and 150 was too high, but it still has an effect. Now, Tversky, who was Kahneman's partner, suggested his idea of why it worked was most things in life, we're not certain of the answer. No one can be certain of the number of calories in an apple. I didn't say how much it weighed. I mean, you cannot know that answer. But you know that there's a grey zone of reasonableness. So when the people started at 150, they said, well, okay, 150 is a bit too high. I'm going to keep on working down. And when they hit the top edge of that zone of reasonableness, which in this case was about 113, they stopped. But the people who got 50 took that as their starting place and moved upwards until they hit the bottom end of the zone of reasonableness. And in that case, it was 75. So a full 50% swing based on this irrelevant number. But, of course, lots of people then think, well, okay, you know, that's a nice little party trick, but frankly, we're in the business of selling things. What has that got to do with the hard-nosed world of commercial advertising? And again, I would argue it's absolutely crucial. And in fact, I would argue the most successful or the most effective ad campaign of all time is partially based on the bias of anchoring. Now, of course, it's a subjective belief. So what do you think the most effective campaign of all time is? Just shout out some thoughts or...
118,
118, oh, well, that's great, very good. A great campaign, but any others? 118, anyone? Advances on 118?
So Apple did a really good campaign. Apple and Microsoft.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Fine.
so the Apple guy and the Microsoft and...
Yeah, brilliant campaign. Yeah, Apple versus Mac. Okay, so, and again, we won't be representative here, so I think this will exaggerate the point. But who's got an Apple phone? Okay, so that is probably 30%, over the population, 25%. So, you know, that is a phenomenal achievement to get 30, 25% penetration with a premium product. However, who here has got married? Can you just get your hands up? Has got married or engaged? Okay. And who either bought for their partner, keep your hands up, sorry, keep your hands up, who bought for their partner or was given a diamond ring? So, okay, anyone drop their hand, or keep your hand up if you didn't buy a diamond ring or get a diamond ring? Okay. So you didn't get a diamond ring? You didn't get a diamond ring? Oh, didn't get a diamond ring. Okay, just one? No diamond ring, excellent. So out of what, there were at least 20 people there maybe? So 95% of people got a diamond ring. I would argue De Beers is the most effective, successful campaign of all time because there's nothing natural about a diamond ring and engagement. In the 1930s, most people did not get diamonds. Were as likely, if they got a ring, to get a ruby, an emerald, or a sapphire. What De Beers did brilliantly was forge this link between durability and the enduring nature of true love, which, if you think about it, is an utterly bizarre link. It might look sensible in retrospect, but you normally want durability in, I don't know, an industrial drill or something. You don't want it in a romantic product. But with this wonderful line by Francis Geraghty in 1947, "A diamond is forever," they built that link. Now, of course, that has nothing to do with anchoring, but that's only so good. You know, yes, you get everyone who gets married to buy a diamond ring, but why would they pay lots of money for what is a reasonably common rock? The way they got everyone to pay so much was anchoring. They went out from the 1940s, the 1950s, and started saying, they created a social norm of you should pay a month's salary. Now, again, how ridiculous is that if you think about it logically? Why would you listen to a salesman when he's telling you to spend so much money? But people did. But like the Apple example, they didn't go out and spend a whole month. They spent slightly less. They didn't, you know, they knew there was some kind of dodginess in this number, but they couldn't help but adjust. So De Beers, knowing they were onto something so good with anchoring, went out again in the late 70s and said, do you know what? What we've been saying for the last 30 years, absolute rubbish, 2 months' salary, that's what you should be paying. And again, people upped their amount. And they didn't stop there. In Japan, there is no heritage, or there was no heritage of diamond rings, so there was no norm. They launched in the 1980s, and they went out and said, it's a 3-month that you should be spending on your salary. A phenomenal piece, $1 billion piece of advertising from a very, very simple bias. And when I say billions of dollars, that is an underestimate. In 1939, De Beers sold $23 million worth of diamonds in the US. In 1979, they sold $2.1 billion worth of diamonds. You know, that's nearly a 100-fold increase. And if you strip out inflation, it's a 19-fold increase. All based, on a great piece of copywriting, of course, but also a phenomenal use of a very simple bias. But then at this stage, there's often some people wondering, well, okay, yes, it can have these big business effects, but that was in the 40s or the 50s or the 70s. We've now got the internet. We're all different. Surely people aren't still affected by these biases. But again, it's just not true. Behavioural science is just as relevant today as it was back in the 1890s or the 1920s. So part of the reason I wrote the book was all around people kept on saying, well, look, you're quoting this study from 1964 or 1920, or even there's one in the book from 1890, a guy called Ebbinghaus. You're quoting these old studies, but consumers have changed so much. So what I tried to do, author a book, every single bias, look at some experimentation of my own to show it's still relevant today. But the example I wanted to talk to you about, which I think has perhaps been the best use of behavioural science in the last kind of 10, 20 years, was from Nespresso. And what Nespresso have done is work with something similar-ish to anchoring. They've worked with this idea of price relativity. So what they've realised is that consumers have no fixed conception of value. They don't know what good or bad value is. In that they don't walk around thinking, well, I'm going to spend £1 per unit of happiness, whether that's on trainers or coffee or cars. There's no cross comparison of category. Instead, people replace a very complicated question that would take phenomenal computing power, and they replace it with an easy question, which is, what have I paid for something similar? Now, we can all remember that. So what Nespresso could have launched is a bit like Dow Egberts. They could have gone out with these half-kilo bags, sat on a Tesco or a Sainsbury's shelf, and positioned themselves next to Dow Egberts and Taylors of Harrogate. That would have probably been the obvious and normal thing to do. But what do you think, if Nespresso was sold in a half-kilo bag, how much would it cost? If it's the same per gram price as it is now, how much do you think it would cost? 50 quid, pretty much spot on. It's about 37, 40 quid, because it does vary a little bit by the different pods. Now, no one in their right mind would walk past the £5 big bag of Dow Egberts, push that away, and take a £37 bag of Nespresso. They wouldn't do it. But what Nespresso did, of course, was launch with these pods. And a pod has a single cup serving, and the comparison set for a single cup serving is, Cafe Nero, Starbucks, where they cost £2.70, £2.80. So suddenly, the 47 pence you spend on the single blend Nespresso looks amazing value compared to £2.70 in Cafe Nero. But 47 pence on a pod and £37 in a 474 gram bag, that is exactly the same per gram price. But they have shifted consumers' willingness to pay by magnitudes by using the bias of price relativity. And again, that can be applied in all sorts of different ways. But rather than stick on price relativity, I wanted to address another criticism of behavioural science. And something you might be even thinking tonight, that, okay, well, maybe it does work and maybe it still works now. But these are all intuitive. We could have worked them out ourselves. You don't need to kind of dress up common sense in academic gowns. And I've got two feelings about that. The first is, well, it doesn't really matter if it's supposedly common sense, if by cataloguing these biases you can get to that good solution quicker. The point of advertising is not to make us look good, it's to sell more stuff. So I don't think that is a fair criticism. And the second reason it isn't a fair criticism is because there are many findings within behavioural science that are completely counterintuitive, that we would never get to through common sense alone, or very rarely get to with common sense alone. And that leads me on to my favourite bias of all, the pratfall effect. So the pratfall effect is the idea that we become more appealing if we admit a weakness. This is Elliot Aronson, so he was the professor of psychology at Harvard in the 60s. And in 1966, he came up with this lovely, simple experiment. He got his colleague to go to a quiz, and he recorded him, he got an audio recorder of him answering quiz questions. Now, his colleague got 92% of those quiz questions right, mainly because Aronson had given them the answers beforehand. But he looks very impressive. Everyone else is getting 70, 80%, even if they were brilliant. But then after the quiz, he stands up and he spills a cup of coffee down himself. So Americans call that a pratfall, or it's what we'd call it a small blunder. And Aronson takes that recording and he goes and plays it to people. And he plays it in one of two ways. So either people hear the brilliant quiz answering and the pratfall, or just the great question answering. And what Aronson finds is that the contestant is seen as significantly more appealing if he's made a mistake. People would want to go out with him for a pint more, they'd want to be his mate more, they think he'd be more better company if he's heard making this mistake. Now, what I thought was, this is very interesting for brands potentially. But Aronson's done it about people. Can we show in some product categories that it works for brands as well? So again, a quick, very simple experiment. So based on the experiment I saw a guy called Adam Ferrier do, I'm just going to flash up two images, and it's going to be two cookies. All I want you to do is answer honestly, which would you prefer to eat? Okay. So you need to think left or right. Do you need more time? Yeah, okay. So who would prefer to eat the left cookie? Okay. And who would prefer the right cookie? So, I mean, not scientific, but probably 75%, it looks like they prefer the left cookie, 25% right cookie. So the cookies are exactly the same, apart from one thing. You've got the original photo of the cookie on the left, and then with the flawed edge. And then all we did, and it's like embarrassing, I couldn't do this myself, I had to get a graphic designer in the agency to do it. This is probably the most expensive experiment of them all. And it's just got a perfectly round edge. So exactly the same, but invariably, and a colleague and I, Jenny Riddell, tested this amongst 626 nationally represented people. 66% preferred the one on the left, 33, 34, or the one on the right. So it repeats generally. Interesting, advertising audiences are always keener on the flawed version, probably because what's the appeal of it, that it's got a flaw, that it's authentic, that it suggests homemade, may well be a reflection of greater spending power and the greater suggestions of those. So again, it can work, and I accept food is a very specific product category, but it can work on brands. Now, one of the other criticisms of behavioural science is, okay, well, a lot of these experiments back in the 60s, back in the 50s were on students. They were in labs. Is that a representative group? What happens if you take the learnings, the experiments out of labs? And a brilliant study by Northwestern University did just that for the pratfall effect. So what we've got here is they studied 111,000 people across 22 product categories. And on the x-axis and the horizontal axis, they put the score of a product rating. So it's from 1 to 5, 5 being perfect. And then on the x-axis, it's likelihood of going through and purchasing that good. So as you see, for every category, you get an increase of likelihood to purchase to begin with. And then for every one of the 22 categories, at some point between 4.2 and 4.5, you see a peak. After that point, likely to purchase drops in every single category. Now, what the researchers argue is perfection is too good to be true. Consumers don't trust it. So therefore, having a flaw makes a brand more appealing. Now, I think the greatest advertisers through time have realised this. Now, you think of the brilliant 1959 onwards VW campaign, the Beetle campaign. They admitted ugly is only skin deep. They admitted their cars didn't look very nice. A less famous little version of that, they admitted the the Beetle was slow. You might not be able to read it, so it says, this is written by Bob Levinson, one of the best bits of copyright I think ever. You can tell them from Volkswagens because a VW won't go over 72 miles an hour, even though the speedometer shows a wildly optimistic top speed of 90. Brilliant. Avis, of course, again from DDB, they admitted they were unpopular. Listerine admitted it tasted awful. Stella that it was expensive. Guinness that it was slow. Even, and this might be stretching the pratfall effect, this is a very strange one. This is the Hans Brinker Hotel in Amsterdam. On the way home tonight, they really start pushing it. Have a look at some of their ads. They just revel in their poor service. And I think all these ads work for three reasons. So firstly, consumers know from experience that advertisers give a partial view of the picture, or they would probably sometimes say even we lie. Not true, but that's maybe the misconception. But we certainly give a partial picture of the truth. Therefore, if you admit a weakness, you have shown tangibly, you haven't claimed you're honest, you've shown you're honest. And therefore, your other claims become more powerful. Secondly, people know again from bitter experience that nothing is perfect in life. There are always trade-offs. And therefore, if you don't say where your flaw is, you leave it up to the imagination of the consumer to choose where that flaw is. And they might choose it in a very important area. Now, Rory Sutherland has argued brilliantly that therefore the pratfall effect was crucial to the success of the low-cost airlines. So remember back to the late 90s probably, the late 90s when the low-cost airlines launched, it was a very strange thing. People had previously been used to flying to Paris for 200 quid, and then suddenly someone was saying they could do it for a fiver or 10 quid. If they hadn't admitted a weakness, if they hadn't admitted their really shoddy service, and remember how much O'Leary pushed the shoddy service, but if they hadn't done that, people may have assumed the cheap price came from cutting corners in safety. And then no one would have flown with EasyJet or Stella. No one would have flown with Ryanair. Ryanair, that's the one. Because they might have thought that they were saving money on mechanics. They were flying fifth-hand Aeroflot jets. They needed to make the trade-off apparent. And then the third and final reason, I think with these brilliant campaigns, what they have been so clever at doing is recognising that weaknesses often have a mirror strength. So VW, we don't care about our looks because we're obsessed with engineering. We don't care about the speed of the car because it's fuel efficiency that matters. Avis, well, yes, we're unpopular, but that gives us a very, very good reason to try hard to make up for it. Listerine, everyone knows things that are good for us taste bad. Therefore, state that and people believe you're a stronger, not quite medicine, but medicated product. Even Hans Brinker, I think there might be something here of, well, we are a dive, but oh my God, by God, we're going to have a good time. Every brand has admitted a weakness, and therefore, consumers in their mind fill in the strength. But if the pratfall effect is so powerful, and we've got academic evidence, we've got evidence that works on brands, we've got real-world product reviews, we've got ad case study. If there's so much evidence, why aren't all brands using it? Now, I've quickly flicked through half a dozen examples of people using it, but the VW one was 1959, so this is over 60 years. I think between us, we could come up with maybe another dozen, but we'd start to struggle after that. In that time, there have been tens and tens of thousands of ads. but only a dozen or 2 dozen have used the pratfall effect. I've even tested this, went and got a weekend's worth of paper, went through the 600 odd ads in the papers, and if you were being strict, I think you would have said none of them exhibited the pratfall effect. If you were being generous, you might say 1 or 2 did. But that is a tiny proportion. And I think the reason it's such a tiny proportion is of something that belights advertising. And it's the principal agent effect. It's an idea from economics from this man, Stephen Ross. It's the idea that there is a divergence of interest between the principal, which is the brand or the company, and the agent, the employee or the marketer. The principal, the brand wants long-term, sustainable, profitable growth. And yes, of course, the marketer wants that as well. But they also want safe career progression. Now, the pratfall effect is probably one of the best ways of being able to achieve long-term profitable growth. But I'm not sure if it's so good for career progression. Because imagine if you were let's say, the stellar marketing director. You'd gone out and told everyone that you were reassuringly expensive. You then get the sales data back in. Sales have bombed for some reason. Maybe, got Heineken have halved their price or whatever. For some reason, sales have bombed. I think you'd probably get fired. I think if you went to your CEO and said you wanted another 5 million quid for another advertising campaign, he would say, well, you're a blinking idiot. You've told everyone the beer's expensive, and of course, people don't want to buy it. So because it's such a risky strategy on an individual level, it doesn't get used enough. But paradoxically, I think that's why if you do decide to go for this route, it will be one of the strongest biases available. Because, as Hegarty says, when the world zigs, zag. If we know one thing about advertising, it's that distinctiveness is memorable. So perhaps for brands that are challenger brands, perhaps for brands that are owned by the family, where there is no divergence of principal and agent, the pratfall effect could be the ideal approach. Now, I've got a soft spot for the pratfall effect because it seems very true of life, and it allows me, whenever I make a mistake, to pretend that I did it on purpose because it's part of the presentation. And with the book, pretty much everything that could go wrong at some stage has gone wrong. They ran out of copies on the first day, so Amazon couldn't sell any for 5 days. Then the next batch got printed with the wrong price, so they all had to go back. Even things that I thought were going very well, like getting really nice reviews, that managed to go wrong after a while. So I had this lovely review from Mark Ritson. Have you heard of Mark Ritson? So he's a professor, Melbourne Business School, Marketing Week guy. He wrote a lovely review. In a cacophony of overstatement, Richard possesses a balanced voice, melodious voice. So I thought, that's great. Sent that along with a few other quotes from Dave Trott and Seth Godin to different magazines and hoped they would run it. And I checked a few days later on this New Zealand site called M&AD, which is their main marketing site. And they'd taken the lovely quote and they'd run this. My book. A cacophony of overstatement. So I emailed the guy back. I emailed the editor back and said, I don't quite think that's reflective of the, the overall tone of the review. And he said, oh, we thought it sounded lovely. So I'm slightly worried about the state of modern journalism, that not quite knowing what cacophony means. But what I certainly didn't want to suggest, though, is it's marketers who have this principal agent bias. Agencies are, of course, just as guilty. Everyone in their job is blending what's right for the brand and what's right for their career. They may never admit it. They might not even admit it to themselves, but they do it. And I thought I'd end on this final example of what's called the Keats heuristic. And it's the idea, very well proven by Jessica Toffig-Bash and Matthew McGlone, that rhymes are seen as more accurate than non-rhymes when you get copy. And they did a very similar thing as I've been talking about, an A/B test. They don't ask people directly, but they test whether or not a line is more believable in a rhyming version than a non-rhyme version. So significantly more accurate. I then replicated their test showing some people some different phrases in the morning, get them to come back in the afternoon, and they were twice as likely to remember the phrases when they saw the rhyming version rather than the non-rhyming version. Now you might think at this stage, okay, so you're telling me rhyme is memorable and rhyme is more accurate. Surely advertisers have always known this. Beans means Heinz, Ariston on, you can with the Nissan, don't be vague, ask for a Hague. Lots and lots of examples. But can you notice one of the themes of all those strap lines I've mentioned? What links them all?
They're short.
They are short, that's fair. They're also all of them are more than 30 years old. So yes, we know this is a truth. Yet when I went to the News UK archives, they've got papers back up 100 years. I went back to 1970, went through the old papers, catalogued what proportion of ads had a prominent rhyme, what proportion didn't. In the 1970s, it was about 30%. It varies whether from the popular press to the upmarket press. And then it just drops year on year on year till you get to 2017 when it's about 5% of ads. Now, the evidence I've done, the evidence Tofig Bash and McGlone have done, this is all very recent. It's between 5 years and 1 year ago. It's not that rhyme has become less powerful. It's just that it's fallen out of fashion. And what I think creatives want to do, and again, this isn't an attack on creatives, it's true for every group, they want to signal their sophistication. They want to show that they are experts. And what rhyme doesn't do is signal your expertise to your peers. It might be effective in persuading consumers, but it's not effective maybe at winning an award or feeling proud of your job potentially. So to finish with, I started with the story of Keisha of AZ. Now what I didn't mention at the time was whilst Latané and Dali's experiments were true, and so the bias of the bystander effect is a genuine one, the story of Keisha of AZ is rubbish. It's a very well-known story. Yes, the Times did run all those stories. It was front-page news that 37 people watched her get attacked and did nothing to intervene. But actually, the New York Post did an expose. They found out that, yes, Kitty Genovese was murdered by Winston Moseley, but several people tried to ring the police. The messages got through to the front desk, and somehow between the front desk and the patrol cars, the message had got lost. And the New York Post allege that what the police did was realise they had screwed up and therefore go out and purposely spread the rumour to the New York Times that the public were at fault. Now, why I want to end on this is that I think so much of advertising is based on anecdote or fashion or what other people are doing. And the plea here would be that we don't have to take any of the theories of what I've said tonight or the experiments I've done on trust. They're so easy to go out and replicate that I would urge you on all your brands to run these simple experiments and prove to yourself, not on my word, but on evidence that you can see, that these biases will work for your brands and they will improve sales. Thank you.